For most of human history, empire was something you could see. Borders expanded when armies marched, shrank when they were defeated. Control was physical for its governors, flags planted in conquered soil. Rome, Spain, Britain, France each ruled by occupying land and directly administering people. Power was measured in territory. If you wanted more influence, you took more ground. This model worked for centuries because the costs were tolerable and resistance could be crushed with force. But by the middle of the 20th century, conquest by invasion began to fail not morally, but economically and politically. The two world wars were the turning point. They revealed that modern warfare had become extraordinarily expensive, destructive, and unpredictable. Maintaining large standing armies, supplying them across continents, and rebuilding after conflict imposed costs that even victorious nations struggled to bear. Britain emerged from World War II technically on the winning side, yet financially exhausted. It had sold off overseas assets, accumulated massive debts especially to the United States, and could no longer afford to maintain its empire. India's independence in 1947 was not only a political decision, it was an economic necessity. France faced similar pressures in Indochina and Algeria. The lesson was clear: holding territory directly was no longer a profitable strategy. At the same time, the international environment changed. The creation of the United Nations and the post-war legal order reframed sovereignty as a near sacred principle. Open territorial conquest became illegitimate. Even when military interventions occurred, as in Korea, Vietnam, or later Iraq, they were justified with language of defense, liberation, or stability, not empire. Occupation became politically toxic at home and abroad. Media coverage, anti-war movements, and rising nationalist resistance made long-term control through force unstable. The cost-benefit calculation of conquest no longer worked. Yet power did not disappear. It adapted. States that had once ruled colonies still needed access to resources, markets, and influence. They needed ways to shape other countries' behavior without the burden of direct rule. The question was no longer how we take land, but how do we get compliance? The answer emerged gradually but decisively through finance, not force. The post-war economic system provided the tools. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design a new global monetary order. The result was the creation of institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, alongside a system that placed the US dollar at the center of global finance. Officially, these institutions were designed to promote stability, reconstruction, and development. And in many cases, they did. Europe rebuilt rapidly with the help of the Marshall Plan, which combined grants and loans to restore industrial capacity and prevent social collapse. But embedded within the system was a new logic of power. Instead of sending troops, creditor nations could send capital. Instead of governors, they could impose conditions. Loans were not neutral transfers of money. They were contracts that shaped policy. When countries borrowed, they did not only take on debt, they accepted constraints on how they could run their economies. This shift became especially important as formal colonialism collapsed. Dozens of newly independent states emerged across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s. They had flags, anthems, and seats at the United Nations. But economically, many were fragile. Colonial rule had left them dependent on exporting raw materials, with little industrial base and limited domestic capital. To build infrastructure, schools, power plants, and hospitals, they needed money. Domestic savings were insufficient. The obvious solution was external borrowing. At first, this borrowing seemed benign. Loans came from former colonial powers, multilateral institutions, and later private banks. Growth rates in many developing countries were strong during the 1960s and early 1970s. But this apparent success masked a structural vulnerability. Most of the debt was denominated in foreign currency, particularly US dollars. That meant repayment depended not just on domestic performance, but on global conditions, interest rates, commodity prices, and exchange rates over which borrowing countries had little control. The vulnerability became painfully clear in the late 1970s and early 1980s. After the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979, many developing countries borrowed heavily to cover rising import costs. At the same time, us and European banks were flush with petrodollars and eager to lend. Then, in 1979, the U.S. Federal Reserve sharply raised interest rates to combat inflation. Global interest rates surged. For debtor countries, this was catastrophic. Debt servicing costs exploded overnight, even though the original loans had not changed. Mexico's 1982 default marked the beginning of the Latin American debt crisis. Within months, dozens of countries were unable to meet their obligations. This was not a result of sudden incompetence or corruption. It was a systemic shock. But the response to the crisis revealed how power now operated. Debtor nations did not negotiate as equals. They turned to the IMF for emergency assistance. The money came but with conditions. These conditions typically required cutting government spending, reducing subsidies, privatizing state-owned enterprises, and opening markets to foreign competition. The rationale was restoring confidence and ensuring repayment, but the effect was to reshape entire economies in ways that favored creditors. Social programs were cut, wages stagnated, unemployment rose, political choices narrowed. Governments could still hold elections, but regardless of who won, core economic policies were effectively locked in by debt agreements. What mattered here is not whether every policy was right or wrong in isolation. It is the shift in the locus of control. Decisions that once belonged to parliaments and voters were increasingly constrained by balance sheets and loan covenants. A country did not need to be invaded to lose autonomy. It only needed to run out of foreign currency. By the end of the 20th century, this pattern had repeated across regions. Africa experienced what is often called a lost decade of development in the 1980s and 1990s, as debt servicing consumed public revenues. According to World Bank data, some heavily indebted poor countries spent more on debt repayment than on health and education combined. Sovereignty, in theory intact, was hollowed out in practice. This is the crucial transition. Conquest became too visible, too costly, and too contested. Debt, by contrast, was quiet. It arrived framed as help development and partnership. It required no troops, provoked no immediate resistance, and could be justified as a borrower's own choice. Yet its long-term effects on policy and power were profound. Modern empires no longer needed to occupy territory. They only needed to occupy the future through obligations that stretched decades ahead. Once debt replaced conquest as a primary mechanism of control, a new form of governance emerged, one that operated without formal rule, but with real authority. At its core was a simple exchange: money now, policy later. Unlike colonial administrators, this system did not require permanent presence or direct command. It relied instead on contracts, conditionality, and the persistent pressure of repayment. The institutions that came to embody this model most clearly were the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, supported by creditor governments and global financial markets. Officially, the IMF's mandate was narrow and technical. It was created to provide short-term balance of payment support, helping countries stabilize their currencies and avoid economic collapse. The World Bank, by contrast, focused on long-term development projects, roads, dams, schools, and later poverty reduction. In theory, these institutions were neutral, technocratic, and apolitical. In practice, their power flowed from a single fact: when countries were in crisis, they were often the lenders of last resort. And when you're the only one willing to lend, you set the terms. Those terms came to be known as conditionality. To receive IMF assistance, governments had to agree to specific policy changes designed to restore macroeconomic stability. This usually meant cutting fiscal deficits, tightening monetary policy, liberalizing trade, and reducing the role of the state in the economy. The logic was internally consistent. If a country was overspending, it needed austerity. If its currency was weak, it needed higher interest rates. If it lacked foreign exchange, it needed exports and investment. But the impact of these conditions went far beyond technical adjustment. They reshaped societies. Subsidies on food and fuel were removed, raising living costs overnight. Public sector employment was reduced, increasing unemployment in economies with few alternatives. State-owned enterprises were privatized, often sold at depressed prices to foreign investors. These policies were not debated as political choices. They were presented as necessities. There was no alternative if the country wanted access to financing. This approach became standardized in what were called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, during the 1980s and 1990s. From Latin America to sub-Saharan Africa, governments facing debt crises entered into similar agreements with remarkably similar conditions. Ghana, Zambia, Bolivia, Jamaica, different histories, cultures, and political systems, yet nearly identical policy prescriptions. This uniformity was revealing. It suggested that local context mattered less than creditor priorities. Supporters argued that these reforms were painful but necessary. They pointed to cases where inflation fell, exports increased, and budgets stabilized. In some countries, macroeconomic indicators did improve, but these gains often came with severe social costs. The World Health Organization documented declines in healthcare access following spending cuts. UNESCO reported falling school enrollment in several adjustment countries. Inequality widened as public protections weakened. Even when growth returned, it was often uneven and fragile. Crucially, the power exercised through debt was indirect but binding. No IMF official wrote laws or commanded police. Yet the effect on national policy was comparable to direct rule. Governments that deviated from agreed conditions risked having funds suspended, which could trigger capital flight and currency collapse. The discipline was enforced not by soldiers, but by markets. Credit ratings fell. Investors pulled out. Exchange rates plunged. The punishment for disobedience was swift and severe. This created a profound asymmetry. Creditors faced limited downside risk. If a country defaulted, losses were spread across banks, institutions, or eventually taxpayers in wealthy nations. Debtor countries, by contrast, faced immediate social and political fallout. Leaders were forced to choose between domestic legitimacy and external solvency. Many chose compliance, even at the cost of unrest. Riots over food prices in Egypt in 1977, Venezuela in 1989, and dozens of other cases were directly linked to IMF-backed austerity measures. What made this system especially effective was that it preserved the appearance of sovereignty. Countries still held elections. Governments still passed budgets. Flags still flew over capitals. But key decisions were pre-negotiated with external actors. Economic policy became a narrow corridor defined by debt obligations. In effect, sovereignty was conditional granted as long as repayment continued. Over time, this model normalized the idea that economic policy should be insulated from democratic pressure. Central bank independence, fiscal rules, and investor protections were framed as safeguards against irresponsible politics. In some cases, they did prevent hyperinflation or fiscal collapse. But they also shifted power away from voters toward technocrats and creditors. Choices about employment, welfare, and development priorities were increasingly constrained by what markets would tolerate. The moral framing of the system was also important. When countries struggled under debt, the narrative often emphasized domestic failure, corruption, mismanagement, populism. These factors were real, but they obscured the structural dynamics. The same global shocks, interest rate hikes, commodity price swings repeatedly triggered crises across multiple countries. Yet responsibility was individualized. Each debtor was treated as uniquely flawed, rather than as part of a system that systematically exposed weaker economies to external risk. By the late 1990s, criticism of this model grew. Protests against the IMF and World Bank erupted from Washington to Jakarta. Even within the institutions, there was acknowledgement that adjustment had often been too harsh and too fast. Debt relief initiatives like the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Program were introduced, reducing some burdens. But the core mechanism remained intact. Access to capital still came with conditions. Policy autonomy was still traded for liquidity. The key point is not that lending institutions consciously set out to build an empire. Power does not always require intent. It can emerge from structure. When one group controls access to something essential, money, in this case, it acquires influence over those who need it. Debt transformed that influence into a durable form of control. Empires of the past ruled through administrators and armies. The modern version ruled through spreadsheets, interest rates, and the ever-present threat of withdrawal. By the time this system had matured, it no longer required constant intervention from institutions like the IMF to exert control. The logic of debt had seeped into the architecture of global finance itself. Markets, ratings agencies, reserve currencies, and interest rates now perform much of the governing work automatically. This was a crucial evolution. Empires of the past needed administrators on the ground. The modern debt-based empire needed only to manage flows of capital and trust. The most important pillar of this system was the hierarchy of currencies. Not all money is equal. A small group of countries issue what the rest of the world must hold. Chief among them is the United States, whose dollar functions as the primary global reserve currency. Oil, commodities, international trade contracts, and sovereign debt are overwhelmingly denominated in dollars. This gives the US an extraordinary structural advantage. It can borrow in its own currency, run persistent deficits, and face none of the constraints imposed on countries that borrow in foreign money. For debtor nations, the situation is fundamentally different. Their governments may collect taxes in local currency, but their debts must often be serviced in dollars or euros. When their currency weakens, the real burden of debt increases instantly, regardless of domestic conditions. This creates a constant pressure to maintain foreign exchange reserves and investor confidence. Policy becomes oriented not toward long-term development or social stability, but toward reassuring external creditors. This asymmetry explains why the threat markets will react badly carries such weight in policymaking. Markets are not neutral observers. They are collective expressions of creditor preferences. Bond yields rise when investors fear default. Credit ratings fall when governments pursue policies deemed risky. These signals then feed back into reality, raising borrowing costs and forcing policy reversals. The result is a self-reinforcing discipline. Governments learn quickly what is acceptable and what is not. The Eurozone crisis after 2008 provided a clear illustration of how this dynamic operates even within advanced economies. Greece, a member of the European Union and a formal democracy, found itself effectively stripped of economic sovereignty. After years of borrowing at low interest rates, its debt became unsustainable following the global financial crisis. When markets lost confidence, borrowing costs exploded. Greece turned to the so-called Troika, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission for rescue. The assistance came with conditions that went far beyond fiscal adjustment. Pensions were cut, wages reduced, public assets privatized, and labor protections weakened. Greek voters rejected austerity in multiple elections and referendums, yet policy remained largely unchanged. As a senior European official reportedly remarked at the time, elections cannot be allowed to change economic policy. Whether the quote was exact or not, it captured the reality. Democratic choice ended where creditor confidence began. Similar patterns have played out across the developing world. Argentina has experienced repeated debt crises despite implementing IMF-backed reforms multiple times. Each cycle followed a familiar script: capital inflows during boom periods, followed by sudden stops when conditions change, leading to devaluation, austerity, and social unrest. Sri Lanka's recent crisis followed the same logic. Heavy external borrowing, combined with currency mismatch and declining reserves, left the government unable to service debt. When default came, policy space collapsed. Negotiations with creditors took precedence over domestic priorities. What distinguishes the system from old-style imperialism is not its impact, but its invisibility. There are no occupying forces, no foreign governors issuing decrees. Instead, there are memoranda of understanding, debt sustainability analyses, and quarterly reviews. The language is technical, abstract, and depoliticized. Power hides behind expertise. Decisions are framed as mathematical necessities, rather than political choices. The beneficiaries of this arrangement are diffuse but real. Global banks earn interest and fees. Investment funds gain access to high-yield assets. Corporations benefit from privatization and market liberalization. Reserve currency countries gain geopolitical leverage. None of these actors needs to coordinate explicitly. The system aligns incentives automatically. As long as debts are serviced, capital continues to flow. When they are not, discipline is imposed. Crucially, this form of control does not require long-term stability in debtor countries. In fact, volatility can be profitable. Crises create opportunities to acquire assets cheaply, restructure labor markets, and lock in reforms that would be politically impossible under normal conditions. Naomi Klein famously described this as disaster capitalism, but the underlying mechanism is debt. Crisis becomes a moment when sovereignty is most negotiable. This does not mean debtor governments are passive victims. Domestic elites often benefit from access to foreign capital and support reforms that favor them. Corruption, mismanagement, and inequality are real and significant. But focusing solely on internal failures misses the broader structure. The system consistently rewards policies that prioritize repayment over resilience. It punishes deviation quickly and often brutally. The ultimate source of power in this model is not ideology, but the ability to say no. Creditors can withhold funds. Central banks can raise interest rates. Investors can exit. Debtor countries rarely have equivalent leverage. They cannot easily refuse repayment without risking financial isolation. This imbalance defines a relationship. In this sense, modern empire does not govern through laws or armies. It governs through constraints. It narrows the range of possible futures. A country may choose its leaders, but its economic path is bounded by obligations incurred long before. The conquest is not of land, but of time. Decades of future output are pre-committed to servicing past debts. No flag marks this occupation. No treaty declares it. Yet its effects are as real as any empire that came before. What makes this form of empire so difficult to confront is not only its power, but its ambiguity. Unlike colonial rule, there is no clear occupier to resist, no single capital to blame. Debt-based domination presents itself as a series of contracts freely entered into by sovereign states. On paper, nothing has been taken by force. The language is voluntary, technical, and legal, and yet the outcomes often resemble those of conquest. Lost autonomy, constrained development, and populations bearing costs imposed from outside their political reach. One reason this system escapes the label of empire is that responsibility is consistently individualized. When a country falls into crisis, the story is framed around national failure. Leaders are accused of corruption, overspending, or populism. Citizens are told they live beyond their means. These narratives are not entirely false, but they are incomplete. They divert attention away from the structural conditions that make crises recurring and predictable. Interest rate cycles set in Washington, commodity price swings driven by global demand, and capital flows controlled by foreign investors shape outcomes far more than local elections ever could. This framing matters because it affects how suffering is understood. Austerity becomes a moral lesson rather than a policy choice. Unemployment and cuts to healthcare or education are portrayed as unfortunate but necessary corrections, not as a result of a system that prioritizes creditor repayment over human welfare. When people protest, they are described as irresponsible or unrealistic, even when they are reacting to the erosion of basic living standards. The system not only constrains policy, it also disciplines imagination. For ordinary citizens, the experience of debt-based rule is indirect but deeply felt. Hospitals run short of supplies after budgets are cut. Public transport deteriorates when investment is postponed. Young people emigrate because opportunities vanish at home. These are not abstract macroeconomic adjustments. They are daily realities. Yet the decisions that produce them are often made in distant boardrooms or negotiations conducted behind closed doors, insulated from democratic pressure. What is striking is how durable this model has proven to be. Despite repeated crises and widespread criticism, The core architecture remains intact. Debt relief initiatives ease pressure at the margins, but rarely alter underlying power relations. New lenders, such as China, have entered the scene, but the logic is similar. Loans tied conditions, assets pledged as collateral, future revenues pre-committed. The players change, the mechanism persists. This raises a deeper question about development itself. If access to capital always requires surrendering policy autonomy, can genuine self-directed development occur? Historical evidence suggests that today's wealthy countries industrialize behind protective barriers, use state-led investment, and manage capital flows aggressively. Many of these strategies are now discouraged or forbidden for poorer nations under the rules of global finance. The latter, as the economist Ha Jun-chong famously argued, has been kicked away. None of this implies that debt is inherently evil or that borrowing should be avoided at all costs. Debt can finance productive investment and smooth shocks. The issue is asymmetry. When creditors face few consequences and debtors bear full adjustment costs, power accumulates on one side. When repayment is treated as sacred but social stability is negotiable, priorities are revealed. The most profound consequence of this system is temporal. Conquest once took land in the present. Debt takes options in the future. It commits generations to servicing obligations they did not choose, narrowing political possibilities before debates even begin. Elections may change leaders, but they rarely change the fundamentals of economic policy. The range of acceptable choices has already been set by balance sheets and repayment schedules. This is why modern empire is so hard to see. It does not march or declare itself. It embeds. It operates through normal procedures, respected institutions, and a language of responsibility. It rarely needs to coerce because compliance is built into the system. Countries discipline themselves to avoid market punishment. Governments preemptively adopt policies to maintain credibility. Control becomes internalized. Understanding this does not provide easy solutions. There is no simple act of decolonization in a world bound together by financial obligations. But clarity matters. As long as debt is treated purely as an economic issue, its political role remains hidden. Recognizing it as a tool of power is the first step toward questioning its legitimacy and imagining alternatives. The age of conquest did not end. It changed form. Empires no longer need to seize territory to rule. They lend, they wait, and over time, they collect not just interest, but influence, autonomy, and the future itself.